Okay, so one evening while I was watching Killing Eve, which is a great show, by the way, I stumbled across the subject of today's episode. So the villain, or assassin, the aptly named Villanelle, is meeting with her handler, Constantine, and she is supremely bored with their first murder assignment. So to get her all excited, Constantine decides to take her to the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam and tries to inspire her with the great works of art somehow. What she does is she looks at the beautiful paintings and she snorts. She looks at all the great statuary and the prints and she snores. She can't even be bothered by all this beauty that's surrounding her until all of a sudden, a single painting stops her right in her tracks.
Wow. They look like bacon.
They look like bacon indeed. Hi, I'm Kathi Rick. In today's episode, we're going to be discussing Jan de Baen's The Corpses of the De Witt Brothers. Welcome to Artis Obscura, Episode 3, Two Swingin' Dudes. So I'd never seen this painting before I had seen that episode of Killing Eve, and being of the same morbid proclivity as Villanelle, I had to find out more. So who the heck were these De Witt brothers, and what happened to them? There's actually a plethora of information about Johan de Witt and a little less about his brother Cornelius. Let's just suffice to say that they were well-heeled, very privileged, smart, and powerful. But let's start at the beginning to try to figure out how two such famous and influential heroes wound up with such a grisly fate. Cornelius was a member of an old Dutch patrician family, the De Witts. He was born in 1623 in Dordrecht, Holland, part of the Dutch Republic. He was the son of Jacob de Witt and the older brother of Johan. In 1650, he became the burgermeister of Dordrecht and a member of the states of Holland of West Friesland. He was afterwards appointed to the important post of Ruwaard, which is the combined functions of the chief of police and prosecuting attorney. In 1667, he was chosen by the states of Holland to accompany Lieutenant Admiral Michiel de Ruyter in his famous raid on Medway. On this occasion, Cornelius distinguished himself by his great coolness and bravery, and was again chosen to accompany de Ruyter in 1672 and took an honorable part in the great battle of Solebay against the united English and French forces. He was compelled by illness eventually to leave the fleet, but found on his return to Dordrecht that the pro-monarchy Orange Party were in the ascendant, and he and his brother, who were staunch, prominent members of the opposing pro-Republican Party, were the objects of popular suspicion and growing hatred. He was arrested on false accusations of treason, and even under heavy torture refused to confess. He was ultimately, unlawfully, condemned to be banished. Johan de Witt had all the makings of a truly successful leader. His father was a well-respected mayor. His brother was a military hero. He had a natural intelligence and statesmanlike disposition, and he grew up during the time when the Netherlands was truly at its zenith. It was flourishing. This was the golden age. He rose in power in Europe during the ascendancy of France and also the bitter political and commercial rivalry with England. He managed to preserve the position of the United Provinces Republic, which is what the Netherlands was known as at that time, which culminated in Spain recognizing their independence in 1648. It wasn't until France and England combined against the Republic in 1672 that De Witt's political system, called the True Freedom, collapsed. The True Freedom consisted of the autonomy of the provinces to the exclusion of Prince William III of Orange from holding high office, a fact that's going to become pretty relevant pretty quick here. First, their father was a part of the Regenten, the merchant ruling class, who was strongly opposed to the monarchists of the House of Orange, a branch of Europe's aristocratic dynasty also known as the House of Nassau. An interesting note, William of Orange, the guy who likely incited the Orangists to murder the de Witt brothers eventually, invaded England and became the king. So he's also responsible for brutal conflicts between Catholics and Protestants that go on to this day in places like Northern Ireland. You know those orange and green parades that cause such violence and grief? Yeah, the Orange Order is from William of Orange. Everlasting grudges from the 17th century.
What are you looking at, you tangerine too?
Okay, Grandad.
I think what's happened here is, now correct me if I'm wrong, but I think your father has just driven through a police barricade.
Well, it's done now.
Oh, that's true. It's probably not even that big a deal if you ignore the fact that orange men are circling us as though we're their fucking prey.
That'll be grand. I'm starting to understand how Moby Dick must feel.
Christ, I'm sweating here. You'll not tell me where I can and can't go my own town! Orange bastards!
De Witt controlled the Netherlands during the Dutch Golden Age. It was a time when the Dutch Empire was one of the greatest powers in Europe. Amsterdam was the center of world trade. The Dutch East India Company dominated Asian trade routes that made the nation very, very wealthy. He was re-elected to this position 3 times. As councillor pensionary, de Witt made great strides in securing and maintaining peace with the other European countries. He also managed to pit the Republic's enemies, England and France, against one another. Through all this, he still opposed the Orange monarchy and refused to let the Prince of Orange, William of Orange, hold a political position. Meanwhile, the tension between the Dutch and English governments escalated to the point of war in 1665, but Johan de Witt managed to maintain control of the seas. But in 1672, things wouldn't work out so well. Political chaos caught up with the Dutch Republic when Louis XIV of France suddenly declared war. The Franco-Dutch War became known as the Dutch Rampjaar, meaning the disaster year, as both England and France attacked and were able to effortlessly invade the Dutch Republic. While the Dutch Navy was strong, their army had been overlooked, and the Dutch people suffered defeat after defeat after defeat at the hands of the French, and Johan's power collapsed. Many thought he'd failed and demanded stronger leadership, and that's where William III of the House of Orange comes in. The people called on William III to take over while they demonstrated against de Witt. This is when Johan's brother, Cornelius, was arrested for treason, subjected to torture, and sentenced to be banished. Having resigned on August 4th, 1672, Johan de Witt went to visit his brother at the Gevangenpoort, or the prison at The Hague. On August 20th, this was not a good day for the de Witt brothers. They found themselves surrounded by a hostile mob in favor of restoring the monarchy. The great writer, Alexandre Dumas, dramatized the murder of the de Witt brothers in his novel The Black Tulip.
He had scarcely left the room when John, who with an almost superhuman effort had reached the stone steps of a house nearly opposite that where his former pupil had concealed himself, began to stagger under the blows which were inflicted on him from all sides, calling out, "My brother! Where is my brother?" One of the ruffians knocked off his hat with a blow of his clenched fist. Another showed to him his bloody hands, for this fellow had ripped open Cornelius and disemboweled him, and was now hastening to the spot in order not to lose the opportunity of serving the Grand Pensionary in the same manner, whilst they were dragging the dead body of Cornelius to the gibbet. John uttered a cry of agony and grief, and put one of his hands before his eyes. "Oh, you close your eyes, do you?" said one of the soldiers of the burgher guard. "Well, I shall open them for you." And saying this, he stabbed him with his pike in the face, and the blood spurted forth. "My brother!" cried Jan de Witt, trying to see through the stream of blood which blinded him what had become of Cornelius. "My brother! My brother!" "Go and run after him," bellowed another murderer, putting his musket to his temple and pulling the trigger. But the gun did not go off. The fellow then turned his musket round, and taking it by the barrel with both hands, struck Jan de Witt down with the butt end. John staggered and fell down at his feet, but raising himself with a last effort, he once more called out, "My brother!" with a voice so full of anguish that the young man opposite closed the shutter. There remained little more to see. A third murderer fired a pistol with a muzzle to his face, and this time the shot took effect, blowing out his brains. Jan de Witt fell to to rise no more. On this, every one of the miscreants, emboldened by his fall, wanted to fire his gun at him, or strike him with blows of the sledgehammer, or stab him with a knife or swords. Everyone wanted to draw a drop of blood from the fallen hero, and tear off a shred from his garments. And after having mangled and torn and completely stripped the two brothers, the mob dragged their naked and bloody bodies to an extemporized gibbet where amateur executioners hung them up by their feet. Then came the most dastardly scoundrels of all, who, not having dared to strike the living flesh, cut the dead in pieces and then went about the town, selling small slices of the bodies of John and Cornelius at 10 sous apiece.
The mob had ripped them to pieces, literally. The mob beat the brothers to death with sledgehammers. They hung them upside down, cut off their fingers, their penises, and other bits, some of which were cooked and eaten, and others were sold as souvenirs. Their hearts were cut out and put on display. Their limbs and pieces of clothing were sold to bystanders at auction. A finger raised 15 to 20 pennies, an ear 25 to 30, and a toe 10 pennies. Pieces of the De Witt brothers were later displayed in pubs. Some of the pieces were dried, and their hearts were preserved in turpentine. Though the exact details haven't been confirmed, it's widely accepted that the murders were savage. It's been said that the Dutch people actually ate De Witt after killing him, with one version even claiming that a member of the mob ate one of his eyeballs. A few of the body parts, a tongue and a finger, were obtained by supporters of the De Witt brothers. The supporters cherished these relics and even had a precious silver box made for them, with a depiction of the brothers' murder engraved on the top. Aside from the body parts, the box also contained documents describing the contents, including a poem that begins with the line, "This box contains the wondrous part of Jan de Witt." These gruesome souvenirs were initially banned from public display for obvious reasons. However, for the last 30 years, they have again been on display at the Historical Museum of The Hague. The love 'em or hate 'em feelings of the public regarding the De Witt brothers' representation in the arts began right after their murders. There were projected statues and portraits that were proposed lauding the De Witt brothers and their contributions, but it was also met with equally strident requests to erect a statue to the man who crushed De Witt's head. Fierce reactions like these were found in dozens of pamphlets that were issued in the early days right after the murders. This damnatio memoriae of the De Witt brothers had everything to do with the fact that the victorious Orangists saw no reason whatsoever to commemorate their opponents, whom they were, by the way, very glad to have out of the way. So upon the explicit wish and recommendation of the Prince of Orange, it was ordained that everything that bore upon the unrest and rebellions in recent times, whatever its nature and by whomever committed, must be and must remain forgotten and forgiven. Today, there are 3 statues of Johan de Witt in the Netherlands, all built in the 20th century, which is the least they could do for the man who was killed and eaten by his own people. So let's get to the painting and start with the artist. Not a ton is known about Jan de Baen. Isn't it always so with artists? De Baen was born in February 1633 in Haarlem, Holland, the Dutch Republic. After his parents died, when he was still a child, he lived with his uncle Hindert Pieman or Piesman in Emden. Jan de Baen received his first painting lessons from this uncle, who was a painter himself. From 1645 to 48, he lived in Amsterdam and was the pupil of painter Jacob Becker. After completing his training, he worked for the exiled court of King Charles II of England, but upon the English Restoration of 1660, he didn't follow his patron, but moved to The Hague, where he worked as a portrait painter. This is where he came to know the De Witt brothers and painted both their portraits from life. He died in 1702, around his 69th birthday, and was buried in The Hague. So let's talk about the painting that stopped Villanelle in her tracks. On the back of the painting, there's an inscription in Dutch which reads, "These are the corpses of Jan and Cornelius de Witt, painted from life by a famous artist as they hung from the whip at 11 p.m. Cornelius is the one without a wig. Jan de Witt has his own hair. This is the only image painted from life on August 20th, 1672. So this painting is horrible. I mean, it was painted at 11 o'clock at night. It looks very much like it was done at the time. If there had been cameras, it's kind of a snapshot. There's a fellow standing in front with a torch who's illuminating these poor disemboweled figures. They're displayed in pitiful nakedness on this gibbet. There's trees in the background at night. It's a night shot, a night scene with stormy clouds. I mean, the whole thing is very oppressive. And I say pitiful, and that's the first reaction that comes to mind. I mean, if you think about it, these were two men who devoted their lives to their country and were heroes. And through a twist of fate and some bad luck and poor decision-making, they wound up looking like a couple pieces of bacon. If you look at their faces, you can see how, at least in Johan is the one that you can see most clearly. He's the one facing the viewer. His nose has been cut off. His eyes have been gouged out. His head is shattered. It's horrible. You move up his body. He's obviously been disemboweled. His fingers have been cut off. You can see his fingers and toes have been cut off. One of the most pitiful parts of this painting for me is he's obviously been castrated, and there's just one tiny little bit of a tendon that's sticking out where his genitals should be. And to think of, I mean, I'm thinking as I'm looking back on the portraits that I've seen painted of both these men, I mean, they were really handsome, intelligent, dedicated men, and to be reduced to something that looks like they're in a butcher's shop is just, it's tragedy. You know, I wrestled with the fact of actually naming this episode what I named it, because it's such a pitiful painting. It's horrific and pitiful. And, you know, much like the painting of Saturn is about the ferocity of the moment, this is the somber tragedy of the aftermath. The way the light is portrayed on this is just very masterful. And there actually is a question whether or not de Baen actually painted this, because I don't think his name is on it, but people who knew him and people who knew his work, and he was there at the time this happened, it's pretty much a consensus that Jan de Baen was the painter of this painting. So what else is there to say about this painting? Honestly, I don't know. I went into this not knowing anything about the de Witt brothers, except that they were two guys that looked like a couple of strips of bacon. And what it turned out to be, with all this research, was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportion. Here were these guys, particularly Johan, who had spent his whole life in service to his country. He stopped wars, he boosted Netherland trade, he kept his country prosperous, and in the blink of an eye, with some bad decision-making with the land army and the rise of William of Orange, he was reduced to a grisly leftover from a mob barbecue. And looking at this painting, I'm overwhelmed with sorrow and grief. It's just a pitiful, pitiful legacy. Well, folks, that was exhausting. But thank you so much for joining us at Artis Obscura, Episode 3, Two Swingin' Dudes, which, by the way, I'm still feeling guilty about naming it that. I feel sorry for those de Witt brothers. But if you have any feedback or would like to support us, please think about going to our Patreon page and being part of our community. You can find a link in the description below. Also know that you can find the show wherever you listen to podcasts. Be prepared for episode 4 of Artis Obscura. It's going to be a real barn burner full of trigger warnings and unspeakable violence. We're going to be discussing Botticelli's Negastio degli Onesti, or the perpetual enduring cult of the dead girl.